Continuing where I left off, Chapter 4. Soon after this there came into the dark chamber to fetch Pierre. Not the Rector, but Pierre's sponsor, Woloski, whom he recognized by his voice. In reply to fresh inquiries as to the firmness of his resolution, Pierre replied, Yes, I agree. And with a beaming, childlike smile he moved forward, walking timidly and unevenly on one booted and one slippered foot, while Woloski held a drawn sword to his plump, bare chest. He was led out the room, along corridors that turned this way and that, and at last was brought to the doors of the lodge. Woloski coughed. He was answered by Masonic mallet knocks, and the doors opened before them. A bass voice, Pierre was still blindfolded, questioned him as to who he was, when and where he was born, and so on. Then who he was, when and where he was born, and so on. Then he was led again somewhere, his eyes still bound, and as he walked they spoke to him in allegories of the toils of his pilgrimage, and of sacred friendship, of the eternal architect of the universe, and of the courage with which he should endure toils and dangers. During this pilgrimage, Pierre noticed that he was called now the seeker, now the sufferer, now the postulant, to the accompaniment of various knockings with mallets and swords. As he was being led up to some object, he was aware of hesitation and confusion among his guides, and he heard a whispered dispute among the men surrounding him, one of them insisting that he should be led along a certain carpet. After that they took his right hand, placed it on something, and told him to hold a pair of compasses to his left breast with the other hand, and to repeat after someone who read aloud the oath of fidelity to the laws of the order. Then the candles were extinguished, and some spirits lighted, which Pierre recognized by the smell, and he was told that he would now see the lesser light. The handkerchief was removed from his eyes, and in the faint light of the burning spirits Pierre saw, as in his dream, several men standing before him, all wearing aprons like the rhetors, and holding swords pointed at his breast. Among them stood a man whose white shirt was stained with blood. On seeing this, Pierre moved forward with his breast towards the swords, meaning them to pierce it. But the swords were drawn back, and he was instantly blindfolded again. Now thou hast seen the lesser light, said a voice. Then the candles were relit, and he was told that he would see the full light. Again the handkerchief was removed from his eyes, and more than a dozen voices said in unison, Sic transit gloria munda. Pierre gradually began to regain his self-possession, and to look about the room and at the people in it. Seated at a long black-covered table were some 12 men in garments like those he had already seen. Some of them Pierre had met in Petersburg society. In the president's chair sat a young man he did not know, with a curious cross hanging from his neck. On his right sat the Italian abbé whom Pierre had met at Anna Pavlovna's 2 years before. Also present were a very important dignitary and a Swiss tutor who had been with the Kuregin family. All preserved solemn silence, listening to the words of the president, who held a mallet in his hand. Set into the wall was a flaming star. On one side of the table was a small rug with various figures worked upon it, and on the other side was something resembling an altar on which lay the gospel and a skull. Around the table stood 7 large candlesticks like those used in churches. 2 of the brothers led Pierre up to the altar, placed his feet at right angles, and bade him lie down, saying that he must prostrate himself at the gates of the temple. He must first receive the trowel, whispered one of the brothers. Oh, hush, please, said another. Pierre glanced around without obeying, a look of perplexity in his short-sighted eyes, and all at once he was assailed by doubt. Where am I? What am I doing? Are they making fun of me? Shall I not be ashamed to remember this? But these doubts lasted only a moment. Seeing the serious faces of those around him, and thinking of all he had already gone through, Pierre realized that he could not stop halfway. He was appalled at his hesitation, and in an effort to evoke his former feeling of devotion, prostrated himself at the gates of the temple. And the devout feeling did in fact come over him, and even more powerful than before. When he had lain there for some time, he was told to get up, and a white leather apron, such as others wore, was put on him. He was given a trowel, and 3 pairs of gloves, and the Grand Master addressed him. He told him that he must try never to stain the whiteness of that apron, which symbolized strength and purity. Then of the unexplained trowel he said that he was to toil with it to eradicate vice from his own heart, and with forbearance to smooth with it the heart of his neighbor. As to the first pair of gloves, men's gloves, he said that Pierre was not to know their significance, but must cherish them. Of the second pair, also men's gloves, that he must wear them at meetings. And finally of the third pair, which were women's gloves, he said, "Dear brother, these gloves are for you too. Give them to the woman whom you shall honor above all others. By this gift you pledge the purity of your heart to her, whom you choose to be your worthy helpmeet in masonry." After a pause he added, "But be aware, dear brother, that these gloves never adorn unclean hands." It seemed to Pierre that the Grand Master was embarrassed as he said these last words. Pierre himself became still more embarrassed, blushing as children do, to the point of tears, and looking uneasily about him. An awkward silence followed. The silence was broken by one of the brothers, who led Pierre to the carpet and commenced reading to him from a manuscript book, an interpretation of all the figures delineated on it: the sun, the moon, a hammer, a plumb line, trowel, a rough-hewn stone, and a cubic stone, the pillar, the 3 windows, and so on. After this, a place was assigned to Pierre. He was shown the signs of the lodge, told the password, and at last was permitted to sit down. The Grand Master began reading the statues. They were very long, and Pierre, from joy, agitation, and embarrassment, was not in a state to understand what was read. He was attentive to only the last words of the statues, which stuck in his mind. "In our temples we recognize no other distinction," read the Grand Master, "but those between virtue and vice. Beware of making any distinctions that may transgress equality. Fly to a brother's aid, whoever he may be. Exhort him that goeth astray. Raise the fallen. Never harbor malice or enmity against thy brother. Be thou kindly and courteous. Kindle in all hearts the flame of virtue. Share happiness with thy neighbor, and may envy never cloud the purity of this bliss. Forgive thy enemy. Avenge not thyself upon except by doing him good. Thus fulfilling the highest law, thou shalt regain traces of the ancient dignity which thou hast lost," he concluded, and getting up, embraced Pierre and kissed him. Pierre looked about him with tears of joy in his eyes, not knowing how to reply to the congratulations and the greeting of acquaintances who surrounded him. He did not acknowledge them as acquaintances. In all these men he saw only brothers, and he burned with impatience to set to work with them. The Grand Master rapped with his mallet. All sat down in their places, and one of them read an exhortation on the necessity of humility. The Grand Master proposed that the last duty be performed, and the important dignitary who bore the title of collector of alms went around to all the brothers. Pierre would have liked to subscribe all he had, but fearing that it might look like pride, he wrote down the same amount as the others. The meeting was over, and on reaching home, Pierre felt as if he had returned from a journey that had lasted for decades, that he was completely changed and had left behind his former habits and way of life. Chapter 5. The day after his initiation into the lodge, Pierre was sitting at home reading a book and trying to fathom the significance of the square, one side of which symbolized God, another the moral, a third the physical, and the fourth a combination of these. From time to time he left off reading in his imagination, began to formulate a new plan of life. The previous evening at the lodge he had been told that a rumor of his duel had reached the Tsar, and that it would be wise for him to leave Petersburg. Pierre proposed going to his estates in the south, and there to attain to the welfare of his serfs. He was happily contemplating this new life when Prince Vasily unexpectedly entered the room. "My dear fellow, what have you been up to in Moscow? Why have you quarreled with Laloya, mon cher? You are under a delusion," said Prince Vasily as he came into the room. "I know all about it, and I can tell you unequivocally that Ellen stands as innocent before you as Christ before the Jews." Pierre was about to reply, but Prince Vasily forestalled him. "And why didn't you come straight to me as to a friend? I know all about it, understand it all," he said. "You behaved as becomes a man who values his honor a bit hastily, perhaps, but we won't go into that. There's one thing you must consider, however, and that is the position in which you are placing me and her in the eyes of society and even the court," he added, lowering his voice. "She is living in Moscow, and you are here. Now enough of this, my dear boy," he said, drawing him down by the arm. "It's simply a misunderstanding. You yourself must feel this, I am sure. Let us write her a letter at once. She'll come home here. Everything will be explained, and there'll be an end to all this talk. Otherwise, let me tell you, my dear boy, you will very likely have to suffer for it." Prince Vasily gave Pierre a significant look. "I have learned from reliable sources that the Dowager Empress is taking a keen interest in the whole affair. You know she is very kindly disposed to Ellen." Several times Pierre attempted to speak, but on the one hand Prince Vasily would not give him a chance, and on the other Pierre himself was loath to take the tone of decided refusal and dissent in which he had firmly resolved to answer his father-in-law. Moreover, the words of the Masonic precept, "Be kindly and courteous," reoccurred to him. He knit his brows, flushed, stood up, and sat again, trying his utmost to do what was for him the most difficult thing in life, to say something unpleasant to a man's face, to say what was not expected by that man, whomever he might be. He was so used to submitting to Prince Vasily's manner of nonchalant self-assurance that he now felt powerless to resist it, but he also felt that his whole future depended on what he said now. It would decide whether he would continue along the same old path or take the new road that had been made so attractive to him by the Masons, and in which they firmly believed he would be reborn to a new life. "Come, my dear boy," said Prince Vasily playfully, "just say yes, and I'll write to her on my own, and we'll kill the fatted calf." But before Prince Vasily had finished his pleasantry, Pierre, not looking at him, but with an enraged expression on his face that recalled his father, mumbled in a voice that was almost a whisper, "Prince, I did not invite you here. Go, please go." And he jumped up and opened the door for him. "Go," he repeated, amazed at himself and enjoying the look of confusion and terror that appeared on Prince Vasily's face. "What's the matter with you? Are you ill?" "Go!" the threatening voice cried once more, and Prince Vasily had to leave without receiving any explanation. A week later, after taking leave of his new friends, the Masons, and leaving large sums of money with them for alms, Pierre set out for his estates. His new brothers gave him letters to the Kiev and Odessa Masons, and promised to write to him and guide him in his new activity. Chapter 6. The duel between Pierre and Dólokhov was hushed up, and in spite of the Tsar's severity at the time in regard to dueling, neither the principals nor their seconds suffered it. But the story of the duel, confirmed by Pierre's rupture with his wife, was the talk of society. Pierre, who had been looked upon with patronizing condescension when he was an illegitimate son, and extolled and fawned upon he was the best match in the Russian Empire, had greatly sunk in the opinion of society once in the marriageable daughters and their mothers had nothing to hope from him, especially as he had neither the faculty nor the wish to court public favor. Now he was alone blamed for what had happened. He was said to be insanely jealous, and subject to his father's fits of bloodthirsty rage. And when Ellen returned to Petersburg after Pierre's departure, she was received by all the acquaintances not only cordially, but with a shade of difference, owing to her misfortune. When the conversation touched on her husband, Ellen assumed a dignified expression, with which, without realizing the impression it made, she adopted with characteristic tact. This expression suggested that she had resolved to endure her affliction without complaint, and that her husband was a cross sent by God. Prince Vasily expressed his opinion more openly. When Pierre was mentioned, he shrugged his shoulders, and pointing to his forehead, said, "Crack, I always said so." "I said from the first," declared Anna Pavlovna, referring to Pierre, "I said at the time, and before anyone else," she always insisted on her priority, "that the absurd young man was ruined by the depraved ideas of the age. I said so even when everyone else was in ecstasies over him, after he had just returned from abroad, and when, if you recall, he posed as a sort of merit as one of my soirees. And how has it ended? I was against this marriage even then, and predicted all that has happened." On evenings, when he was free, Anna Pavlovna continued to give her soirees as before, soirees such as only she had the gift of arranging, at which was to be found, à la crème de la véritable bonne society, la fin fleur de l'essence intellectuelle de la société de Petersburg, as she herself put it. Besides this discriminating selection of the society, her receptions were distinguished by the fact that she always presented some new and interesting person to her guest, and that nowhere else could the political thermometer of legitimate Petersburg court society be more accurately and clearly read than there. Toward the end of the year 1806, when all the distressing details of Napoleon's destruction of the Prussian army at Jena and the Ostart, and the surrender of most of the Prussian fortresses had been received, when our troops had already entered Prussia and our second war with Napoleon was beginning, Anna Pavlovna gave one of her soirees. La crème de la véritable bonne society consisted of the fascinating, unfortunate Ellen, who had been deserted by her husband, Mortemart, the delightful Prince Hippolyte, just back from Vienna, two diplomats, an old aunt, a young man referred to in that drawing-room simply as a man of great merit, un homme de beaucoup de mérite, a newly appointed lady-in-waiting, and her mother, and several less notable persons. The novelty Anna Pavlovna was offering her guests on this occasion was Boris the Ratoskoy, who had just arrived as a courier from the Prussian army and was aide-de-camp to a very important personage. What the political thermometer indicated to the company on that particular evening was the following: however much that European sovereigns and commanders may encourage Bonaparte with the object of causing me, and in us general, these annoyances and mortifications, our opinion in regard to Bonaparte cannot alter. We shall not cease to give undisguised expression to our views on this subject, and can only say to the King of Prussia and others, "So much the worse for you, tu las vula Georgia Dandin," and that is all we can say. This was the political thermometer reading at Anna Pavlovna's soirée. When Boris, who was to be served up to the guest, entered the drawing-room, almost all the company had assembled, and the conversation, guided by Anna Pavlovna, was about our diplomatic relations with Austria and the hope of an alliance with her. Boris, in the elegant uniform of an aide-de-camp, looking fresh, rosy, and more manly, came into the drawing-room with easy assurance, and was duly conducted to pay his respects to the old aunt, and then brought into the general circle. Anna Pavlovna gave him her shriveled hand to kiss, introduced him to several persons whom he did not know, with a whispered designation of each: Prince Hippolyte Kuragin, Jean-Much June Hamé, Monsieur Krug, Charge d'Affaires de Copenhague, un spirit profound, and simply Monsieur Chatoff, in home de beauty cap de mérite of the young man always so described. Thanks to Anna Mikhailovna's efforts, his own tastes, and the peculiarities of his circumspect nature, Boris had succeeded by that time in obtaining for himself a most advantageous position in the service. He was aide-de-camp to a very eminent personage, had been sent on an extremely important mission to Prussia, and he had just returned from there as a courier. He had completely assimilated the unwritten code that had so delighted him at Umutz, according to which a lieutenant might rank incomparably higher than a general, and by which the requirements for success in the service were not endeavor, not work, valor, or perseverance, but simply the faculty of getting on with those who confer the rewards. And he often marveled at the celerity of his own advancement and the failure of others to grasp these matters. His whole manner of life, all his relations with former friends and acquaintances, all his plans for the future were completely changed as a consequence of this discovery. He was not rich, but he would rather have deprived himself of many pleasures than allow himself to be in a shabby carriage or appear in the streets of Petersburg in an old uniform. He cultivated the friendship and sought the acquaintances only those who were above him in position and could therefore be useful to him. He liked Petersburg and despised Moscow. His recollection of the Rostovs' house and of his childish love for Natasha was distasteful for him, and since the day of his departure for the army he had not once been to see them. To be in Anna Pavlovna's drawing room he considered an important advance in the service, and instantly comprehending his role there, let his hostess make the most of whatever interest he held for her guest, while himself carefully observing every face and appraising the advantages and possibilities of establishing relations with each of those present. He took the seat indicated to him besides the beautiful Ellen, and listened to the general conversation. Vienna considers the basis of the proposed treaty so unattainable that not even a series of the most brilliant successes will bring them within the range of possibility, and she doubts the means we have of gaining them. These are the actual words of the Vienna cabinet, said the Danish charge d'affaires. The doubt is flattering, said Homo Spirit profound with a subtle smile. One must distinguish between the cabinets in Vienna and the Emperor of Austria, said Mortemart. The Emperor of Austria could never have thought of such a thing. It is only the cabinet that says it. Ah, mon cher Vicomte, but in Anna Pavlovna, Europe, for some reason she pronounced it Europe, as if that were a special refinement of French, with which she could permit herself when conversing with her Frenchmen. Europe ne serait jamais notre aller sincere. Having said this, she turned the conversation to the courage and firmness of the Prussian king, with the object of bringing Boris into action. Boris listened attentively to each of the speakers, awaiting his turn, and at the same time managed now and then to glance at his neighbor, the beautiful Ellen, who several times met the glance of the handsome young aide-de-camp with a smile. Speaking of the position of Prussia, Anna Pavlovna very naturally appealed to Boris to tell them about his journey to Glogau and the condition in which he had found the Prussian army. Boris, without undue haste and in pure and elegant French, told them a great many interesting things about the armies of the court, carefully refraining from any expression of his own opinion in regard to the facts he was relating. He held the attention of the company for some time, and Anna Pavlovna felt that the novelty to which she had treated her guest was generally appreciated, but it was Ellen who showed the greatest attention to what Boris had to say. She asked him several questions about his journey and appeared to be exceedingly interested in the state of the Prussian army. As soon as he had finished, she turned to him with her habitual smile. "You really must come and see me," she said in a tone that implied that certain circumstances of which he could have no knowledge made this absolutely imperative. "Tuesday, between 8 and 9. It will give me great pleasure." Boris promised to comply with her request, and was about to begin a conversation with her when Anna Pavlovna called him away on the pretext that her aunt wished to hear his story. "You know her husband, of course," said Anna Pavlovna, closing her eyes and indicating Ellen with a melancholy gesture. "Ah, such an unfortunate, charming woman! Don't speak of him before her, please. Don't even mention him. It is too painful for her." Chapter 7. When Boris and Anna Pavlovna returned to the others, Prince Ippolit had usurped the conversation. Leaning forward in his armchair, he said, "Leo de Prusse," and having said this, he began to laugh. Everyone turned toward him. "Leo de Prusse," he repeated in an interrogative tone, again with a laugh, then calmly and gravely settled back in his chair. Anna Pavlovna waited a moment for him to go on, but as he seemed quite decided to say no more, she began to tell of how at Potsdam the impious Bonaparte had made off with the sword of Frederick the Great. "It is the sword of Frederick the Great that she began, but I politely interrupted her. "Leo de Prusse," he said, and again, as soon as everyone turned toward him, He excused himself and felt silent. Anna Pavlovna frowned. Mortimer, Ippolit's friend, addressed him peremptorily. Well, what about your Roy de Prussy? Ippolit laughed as though ashamed of his own laughter. Oh, nothing. I only meant... He had been trying all evening to repeat a quip he had heard in Vienna with the French idiom Roi de Prusse, meaning to have one's trouble for one's pain. I only want to say that it's useless to make war for Roi de Prusse. Boris smiled circumspectly, a smile that could be taken as ironical or appreciative, according to the way Sally was received. Everyone laughed. Your jest is really too bad, very witty, but unjust, said Anna Pavlovna, shaking a shriveled finger at him. We are making war not for le roi de Prusse, but the right principles. Ah, that wicked Prince Ippolit, she said. The conversation, turning on the political news, did not flag, and toward the end of the evening, when the subject of the rewards bestowed by the Tsar came up, it became particularly animated. You know, last year, received the snuff-box. With the portrait, said L'Homme d'Esprit Profound. So why should S receive the same reward? I beg your pardon, a snuff-box with the Emperor's portrait is a reward, but it is not a distinction, said a diplomat. A gift, rather. There are precedents, Schwarzenegger, for instance. It's impossible, objected another. Bet on it. The ribbon of the order, that's another matter. When everyone got up to go, Ellen, who had said very little evening, came, again turned to Boris, and in a meaningful, caressing tone, urged him not to forget Tuesday. It is of great importance to me, she said with a smile, looking around at Anna Pavlovna, and Anna Pavlovna, with the same melancholy smile that always accompanied any reference to her exalted patroness, sanctioned Ellen's wish. It appeared that from something Boris had said concerning the Prussian army, Ellen had suddenly found it necessary to see him. Her manner seemed to convey a promise to explain this necessity when he came on Tuesday. But on Tuesday evening, in Ellen's magnificent salon, Boris received no clear explanation of why it had been so urgent for him to come. There were only guests. The Countess talked little to him, and only as he kissed her hand on taking leave did she unexpectedly say to him in a whisper, her face singularly unsmiling, "Come to dinner tomorrow evening. You must. Do come." During that sojourn in Petersburg, Boris became an intimate in the Countess and Bezukhova's house. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Leave a comment below, subscribe, or keep watching. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.